Thank you for being here for our annual spring breakfast. And I'm Doug Wright. I'm the chairman of Envision Utah. And what a great thing that is, to be the chairman of such an incredible group and to watch so many amazing things happen under the umbrella of Envision Utah. It's such a unique organization, and I'm proud to be a part of it. For the last couple of years, we've all been looking at each other on computer screens, and we've all been trying to mute and unmute our mics. My favorite are the unmuted mics, where we hear everybody making a subsequent phone call, the dog barking, and their kids yelling at them. Those are some of my favorite moments over the last 2.5 years. But isn't this a joy to be together in person? I've seen people that I've only seen in Zoom meetings. Yeah, let's hear it for that. Somebody was applauding. Thank you. You know, Envision Utah, most of us in the room know what Envision Utah is, but I'd like to make sure that we all understand exactly how this organization functions. We work together to keep Utah the great place that we all know and love, and many of us have grown up. Many of us are newly discovered Utah fans, and what a wonderful place this is to live. We work with Envision Utah, with the policymakers. This is what makes this organization so truly unique, is the bringing together of the various people, rank and file Utahns like myself, to the movers and shakers, owners of businesses, politicians. It makes such a difference. So the policymakers come together with us, and the business leaders, the local elected officials, we have many of them here tonight, developers. I was just chatting with several of our great developers who are here today, planners, the environmental groups, community leaders across the state. We're trying to anticipate what some of the potential challenges are going to be for this wonderful, wonderful place we live, the opportunities that are coming our way, looking into the future, trying to find ways to make Utah the kind of place, and boy, isn't this key, especially when you get to be my age. I start wondering, what is this great state of ours going to be like for my children and my grandchildren? You know, in Envision Utah, we are a nonprofit. This is not primarily a fundraiser, although that's certainly an important function of our breakfast. But again, this just embraces what Envision Utah is all about, bringing all of us together to sit down, to talk, to enjoy a meal, to hear some great ideas and speakers. We'll hear from a great speaker today, talk about Utah's future. It'll give us a chance to figure out what our role is, either as an individual, just a great citizen of the state of Utah, or as a business leader, or as a politician, or as someone who works in community activity. And we'll dive into some of these issues that matter most. But again, we are a nonprofit, and we always appreciate your financial support. Just by being here today, you are participating in that effort. There's a QR code that is on your table that will take you to a donation page. And we'd be very, very grateful for any financial support that you would feel comfortable in giving. We're trying also to do something new today, and that is to have a virtual program for you. There's a QR code on your table where you can access that as well. We'd like to invite you to go ahead and start enjoying your meal this morning as we acknowledge some of our great sponsors. So don't feel you need to wait, and we would love to have you start enjoying this meal. And by the way, we have so many distinguished guests and participants with us today, but as I was walking in, I noticed that our former governor, our former lieutenant governor, our former county commissioner in Utah County is with us today. Let's hear it for Governor Gary Herbert, and thank you so much. Governor, thank you for all you've done for our state. And Governor, remember, there's always a very cheap lunch awaiting you at Bee's Hangout in Eureka, Utah. So he's actually said he'd come someday. I want to thank our sponsors. Our headlining sponsor is Jacobson Construction, Larry H. Miller Real Estate, Deseret Management Corporation, and we could not have done this event without you, without your support, and we thank you so very, very much. Some of our other great sponsors too, a gold sponsor, Dominion Energy. Thank you, Dominion Energy, for bringing natural gas and helping Eureka get into, if not the 21st century, the 20th century. Dominion Energy, thank you. My house will soon have natural gas. No more coal, no more wood pellets, no more outrageously expensive other forms of fuel. We also want to thank our silver sponsors, Cowboy Partners, CW Urban, and Intermountain Healthcare. Thank you so much. And bronze sponsors, Ivory Homes, Rocky Mountain Power, Utah Association of Realtors, Utah Real Estate Development, LLC, Summit Sotheby's, and also the Wasatch Front Regional Council. Could we hear it for all of our great sponsors who really stepped up? And as always, there is a thanks due to the George S. and Dolores Dore Eccles Foundation for their generous 2-to-1 match, which makes all of our donations go further in making Utah a better place. And now I'd like to introduce, for a few introductory remarks, our Envision Utah President and CEO, Ari Bruening. Ari.
Well, thanks, Doug, and thank you again to all of our sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. And thank you all for being here to listen to me and Allie. Looking forward to hearing from Allie. So at Envision Utah, we're all about planning for the future. So I figured I'd start out by talking about the past. So my first ancestors to arrive in Utah were John and Adelia Lambert. They came in 1850. They were fleeing religious persecution in Nauvoo, Illinois. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, I had more ancestors come join them from England and Denmark, including, I think, my smartest ancestors who came on a railroad in 1869, 3 months after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Now this is Anton Hubert Bruening, from whom I get my last name. He came from Germany in the late 1890s, went to Illinois, and then the family story is he came to Utah for a job in the early 1900s. And my last ancestors to come to Utah are the Bodines, pictured here. They came from the exotic place of Texas. And I'm not entirely sure why they came to Utah. I think there were probably some religious reasons, but also, who wouldn't choose Utah over Texas? I mean, really. So I wanted to share this with you. In a way, my family story is kind of the story of Utah. We've been a rapidly growing place for a long time. People have come for religious reasons. They've come for economic reasons, for jobs. They have come because Utah is just a great place. And then they have children. And then, look, I'm here, because they did have children. Now, this shows the percentage growth over time. So obviously, we're still rapidly growing. So anybody here who moved here from out of state, why don't you raise your hand? Don't worry, we're not going to run you out of town. That's a lot of you. Now, don't give them dirty looks. Now, now raise your hand if you have more than 2 kids. Okay. Now, if somebody raised their hand twice, they're really the problem. This is why we have growth, right? Actually, we're all part of this Utah growth story, right? we've come here for different reasons. Our ancestors came for different reasons. We have children. And by the way, having children, that family-friendly nature of Utah is one of the things Utahns love most about Utah. We recently asked Utahns what they really like about Utah, and they cluster in 3 different categories. The first thing, it has to do with the community that's here, the good people. It's a safe place. It's a family-oriented community. People love that about Utah. The second category has to do with the economy. You can get a good job. That pays well. It's affordable. Well, it used to be. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's scenic beauty and outdoor recreation. That's the third category. So these are the 3 things people love about Utah, and these are the 3 reasons we grow. So our kids love this about Utah, and they stay, and they can stay because they can get a job. And other people come join us, and then they have kids too. This is why we grow. Now, growth brings some challenges, though. Traffic, air quality, water, loss of farmland, increasing housing costs. On the other hand, growth is a good problem to have. It means we're a great place that people want to live. It's good to have a sign that you're a great place, right? But what do we do about those challenges? Now, in this same study, we asked Utahns how they felt about growth. And this is something we've been doing for about 25 years. And we saw a higher concern about growth than we've ever seen in our 25-year history. So people now are more likely to say that growth on net will make things worse rather than better in Utah. And for the first time, they are more likely to say that growth should be strictly managed and limited rather than encouraged and fostered. So people are concerned about growth. We pulled this statement from the Deseret News. And as I read this, you can think about when you think this was written. I find the settlements crowded up to their utmost capacity, land and water all appropriated, and our young people as they marry off have no place to settle near home. The resources of the people are exhausted unless they go into manufacturing. So you can take a guess as to when this was written. 1885. Population of Utah was less than 200,000. So not only is growth not something new to Utah, concerns about growth are not something new to Utah as well. And in fact, that's why Envision Utah exists, to help us deal with this issue. So why are people so concerned about growth? We asked them that, actually. We had them pick their top 3 concerns about growth, and topping the list is housing costs. Shortage of housing. They see the growth causing demand for housing, drives housing costs up. And in fact, I won't show you some of the other results, but it's clear that housing and cost of living is now Utahns' #1 concern about life in Utah. 7 years ago, it was air quality. It has now been supplanted by housing. But that's not the only concern. Other concerns are traffic, environmental impacts, things like air quality, for example, pressure on our natural resources, water, and so forth. So we have all these concerns about growth. What do we do about it? You might ask yourself, why don't we just stop growing? Well, I showed you the 3 reasons we grow. And as far as I can figure, the only way to stop growing is to get rid of those 3 reasons. To not have a strong economy, to not have a great place to live. That would slow our growth, but at what cost? So we could stop trying to promote a strong economy. We could drive up our housing costs. And we would slow our growth. We could stop growing. Our kids would move somewhere else. That could happen. But I don't think that's where most of us want to go. And so the question isn't how much should we grow or should we grow? The question really is how should we grow? That's what matters. If we make the right decisions about how, we can keep Utah a great place to live. Utah will change because of our growth, but we can preserve much of what we love about Utah and even make it better in a lot of ways. So as an example for what the how we grow can do for us, when we started our work at Envision Utah in 1997, and experts put together projections of what life would be like in Utah in 2020. So they projected that our water use per capita would be over 290 gallons per day, So that's a total of about 774 million gallons of water per day in the greater Wasatch area. But we grew differently than they projected, and now we're using almost 200 million fewer gallons per day. They projected back then if we kept growing the way we were, we would develop another 130 square miles per decade. But again, we grew differently, and so we saved 67 square miles per decade of land. It was projected that we would drive 62 million total miles per day on the Wasatch Front, but we're actually driving 9 million fewer miles per day than that projection. And it was projected that we'd emit 2.6 million tons of air pollutants per day on the Wasatch Front. And we're emitting 1.7 million fewer tons of pollution per day than those projections. So how did we do it? It wasn't by stopping growth. In fact, the growth projections back then were almost exactly right. The way we did it is by growing differently. It was how we grew. So for example, we built 140 miles of passenger rail. We allowed a wider variety of housing types, especially around those rail stations, and it led to different outcomes. So that was planning for 2020 back in the late 90s. 2020 has come and gone. We've added over 1 million people to our state. So we think it's time to have a conversation again about how we grow in Utah. How are we going to deal with this growth? So we need to come together, get on the same page so we can build the future we want to see rather than letting the future happen by chance. So I went to Panda Express, and this was the fortune I got. So it seemed pretty fitting, right? So let's work together to envision the future we want to make a reality rather than letting the future happen by chance. So please join us as we work with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget and numerous other partners to have a conversation about growth. We need your participation, and we need your help reaching as many Utahns as possible. So you can go to our website and sign up for our newsletter and then watch for opportunities to participate. Together, I think we can keep Utah a great place to live for ourselves and for our children and our grandchildren. I always think about my son, who in 2050 will be roughly my age, and that's who I'm planning for. So, yes, I am part of the problem too. I have children. So, once again, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, and we really look forward to hearing from Ali as our keynote speaker, and thank you very much.
I want to know what Panda Express he goes to. I won't tell you what my fortunes say. It's time for what all of us have really been looking forward to, the special guests that we have. Ari mentioned that housing is one of our biggest concerns in the state of Utah. How many of you who have, like Ari and myself, we have our kids here, we want them to stay if they choose. There are other opportunities. There are wonderful places that people can live, but many of us, we look at our kids and we hope that they'll be accessible to us. How many of your kids right now could afford the house that they live in? My son Ian bought a home about 6 years ago. There's no way that he and his wife Tyra could afford the home that they live in right now if they had to rebuy it, especially with the bump in interest rates that we've had. My daughter Katie and her husband Avery, who live in the Marmalade area, they would have a very, very difficult time rebuying the very townhouse that they live in. It's a big issue. At our legislative breakfast on Capitol Hill a few months back, the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, expressed real concern for his kids and their ability to stay in Utah and to be able to afford their own home and even affording rent in the state of Utah. Everybody's struggling with this around the country, but especially here in Utah. And we know, as Ari pointed out, what happens in our state doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are things that we can do. So we wanted to invite someone to our breakfast today who could bring a national perspective. This is a national issue, of course. Everywhere that we searched for a national expert on this, Ali Wolf's name kept coming up. And we're grateful that she's here, and we're excited to hear what she has to say. Now, this is how the program will unfold. Laura Hansen, who is our State Planning and Infrastructure Coordinator and Managing Director of the Planning Coordination in the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and a member of, we're very proud to say, of Envision Utah's Executive Committee, will introduce our keynote speaker. After the keynote, we thought that the only thing better than having one great expert would be to have several on stage in the housing market. So another expert will join us and will ask questions up here. After the keynote, that will occur, and then Taylor Mammen, who is CEO of RCLCO. Fund advisors will join Ali on stage for a brief fireside chat. We'd like to have a conversation with them, but Taylor is from originally Utah, but now runs RCLCO from Los Angeles. Taylor is a board member for Envision Utah and has been a partner on many Envision Utah projects over the years, and it should be a fascinating conversation. So we would invite, and by the way, during Ali's remarks and the fireside chat that we're going to have, if you have any questions at all that you'd like to ask, you can text them to, if you got your pencils and pens out, 801, that's kind of a given, 303-1453. We'd really love your input. We want this to be a conversation that includes everybody. So if you have a question for them, 303-1453. And we should have time to ask Ali a few of your questions at the end as well. So let's turn things over for the introduction to Laura Hansen.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite events of the year. There's always such great speakers. We learn so much, and I'm so appreciative of all of the work that Envision Utah has done for our state over the past 20 years. Looking at those statistics of how we've grown differently, I think tells a pretty remarkable story about all of the things that we've been able to accomplish here together. So as Ari described, there's been a major shift in how Utahns feel about growth. It used to be that our state was rah, rah, rah growth. You know, we really wanted to foster that and work towards growing our community, but things have started to change. More and more Utahns are starting to feel like growth is a negative and something that we need to avoid. But if you look closely at that data, the only factor that has changed in Utah's minds as much as their feelings about growth is their attitudes about housing and the cost of living in Utah. And so in other words, if you dig into this, maybe our concern about growth is really a reflection of worsening housing prices more than really anything else. And so if we want to understand how to deal with growth, we really need to understand our housing market. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ali Wolf. She is the chief economist for Zonda, which is a firm that provides data, insights, and tools to professionals in almost every level of the home building industry. She knows a lot about the housing market and has huge amounts of data to back all of this up. She works with some of the nation's largest home builders, presents across the country. She's been the go-to expert on national media, including CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Yahoo Finance, and more. She serves as an advisor to the White House on U.S. housing market issues, and she's focused a lot of her own career on understanding recessions and built a name for herself as an expert on millennials in the housing market. A true sign of the dedication to her craft, when asked if she wanted to fill her free time, how she wanted to fill her time after this event, she told the Envision Utah team that she really wanted to drive around, visit housing developments, and get a better sense of what's happening on the ground here in Utah. She has degrees from Ohio State University and the London School of Economics, and she claims she got her start in the housing by building multifamily dwellings for chickens on her family farm in Ohio. Please welcome me in joining our keynote speaker, Ali Wolf.
you, Laura, and hello, everyone. I am excited to be here, and thanks to Envision Utah and the team for getting me here, because we have a lot we need to go through, from the state of the housing market to the wider economy, my focus here being on Utah. So as mentioned, I am Allie Wolf. I'm the chief economist with Zonda. If you're not familiar with Zonda, we are a housing data and consultancy firm. We track the entire building life cycle from raw land all the way up into the closing out of new home communities. Now, our proprietary data comes from the new home market. But of course, to understand trends, you have to know what's also happening in the existing home space, what's happening with policy, what's happening in different markets across the country. And you'll see a little bit of all of that in today's presentation. I have an estimated 32 minutes to get through 5 sections. We're going to start high level. Give me about 5 minutes to go through the economic backdrop. Let's all get on the same page. From there, we'll go into the shifting market, which is some of the early signs that housing is looking maybe a little bit different than it did just a couple weeks ago. We'll go into the buyer pool. Who's been driving the market, and what are some of the risks and opportunities from there? Challenges. You heard a lot about challenges and what's happening with growth and how growth is pushing up prices, and how are we going to address that? How can we learn from that? Taylor and I will talk about that later in our discussion. And then the final thoughts. I'll give you a couple things that I think are worth thinking about as you're trying to plan forward. But let's start with that economic backdrop. And I want to start high level. Let's just set the tone for Salt Lake City. When we're looking at the market, depending on the MSA that you're looking at, the unemployment rate is between 1.8 and a little over 2%. Nationally, 3.6%, so outperforming the national number. I think it's some of the lowest, or if not the lowest, unemployment rate in the country. When you're looking at the unemployment numbers, those are historically numbers we like to look at, but we also know the market is changing. And it's changing by how the economy is broken up. So what we like to do is look at high-income job growth, just as a proxy for how many people are out there that are likely going to be able to own homes. 100% would mean all of the jobs lost during the pandemic have been come back. 111% here locally, showing the support and the growth that we've seen in the high-income sector. When you look at job postings, there are nearly 70% more job postings today compared to where we were before the pandemic. Companies are still looking to grow and expand, but they're finding that people that want jobs already have jobs, and that's pushing wages up. There are many ways to measure wage growth. One I like is the Employment Cost Index. This is up a little about 4.5%, the highest level in over 20 years. That's the national number. If you look at Mountain, 5.8%. Makes sense that the wage growth number is higher. You have a tighter labor market than what you see for the national averages. So you're looking at this. Labor market, pretty strong. Like we said, people that want jobs have jobs. They're bringing in more money. Consumers are willing and able to spend their money, but then we're running into some challenges. And those challenges are related to the supply chain and to the supply and demand imbalance that you see not only in the housing market, but spread across the economy. And what that's doing is pushing inflation up. We all know this is the #1 issue in the economy today. We have inflation, headline consumer price index at 8.3%, when a healthy, well-functioning economy should have an average of 2%. This level of inflation is the highest level it's been in over 40 years. It is spread across the economy, and the absolutely horrific events that are happening in Ukraine are also contributing to inflation lasting longer than what was originally expected. Plus, the new shutdowns that are happening in China that are playing into what's happening with the supply chain. So as we look at this, we know that the labor market is strong, but what we've found is we've gone from this point where we're in this good, healthy environment to actually a really unhealthy and unsustainable environment, which is why many of you probably know what the Federal Reserve is at least communicating they're expecting to do, which is 7 short-term rate increases, not mortgage rate increases, short-term. We'll talk about the difference in a moment. Now, when you're looking at this, there are a few things you need to know. Federal Reserve can tell you they want to raise rates 7 times. They may not have to. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When you're looking at a change in Federal Reserve policy, what you need to remember is the Federal Reserve is raising rates because the economy has overheated. They're trying to slow it down. If job growth data slows, if GDP data slows, housing data slows, that's partly by design to try to get us back into a healthier level. But the question is, can the Federal Reserve pull off a soft landing or a hard landing? So many of you are probably familiar with this. A soft landing is that the increases are effective. They bring down the level of inflation. We get to this healthier path of growth. My team at Zonda, we pulled the past 11 times the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates. Out of the 11, 3 times they pulled off a soft landing. The balance, they pulled off a hard landing meaning a recession. So as we're talking about this, know that the recession is part of the backdrop. I'm sure a lot of you are reading it every single day now as you open the national headlines about how the market just feels like it's shifting. But there's an interesting dynamic, because right now the Federal Reserve has done 2 short-term rate increases totaling 75 basis points. And if you look at the mortgage market, we know that mortgage rates are up over 200 basis points, meaning the market is driving interest rates quicker than what the Federal Reserve is communicating. In theory, markets are efficient. This is capturing that. Investors are baking in the rate increases, quantitative tightening, inflation that is lasting longer than expected, and what that's doing is pushing those interest rates up. Now, if you have followed the interest rate trends, a few weeks ago we were getting very close to 6%. There is a nearly perfect correlation between the 10-year Treasury yield and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Luckily, the 10-year has come down. As that has come down, we've seen interest rates go down from almost 6%. The quote I collected this morning from a top loan officer was 5.4%. So we've come down in relative terms, but you also have to think about, why did we come down? Why have we seen interest rates go from almost 6 to 5.4? The answer is investors are more nervous about a recession. So in an interesting way, what happens to the fears of where the market goes does play into what happens to financing on the ground in the housing market. But I want to take that conversation of what we're seeing on the high level and apply it to the housing market. The fact that last year we had a slide of all of the different economic forecasters that we could get access to their forecasts. All of us, I think there were 6 of us, we included our forecast and all of these different forecasts for mortgage rates. The highest person on that list was a 4% interest rate. And so we can see that the market changed a lot quicker than really anyone had expected. And for a while, we were in this interesting place where the market was still holding up exceptionally well. So let me add a little bit of layer of context to this. Like we mentioned, Zonda tracks the entire building life cycle, but oftentimes data is lagged. And so we have to supplement that with some qualitative information that we get through a division president survey. This is talking to home building leaders across the country. And in April, we had said to the builders, how is the market doing? We think sentiment from a builder becomes important, especially when you're trying to think forward with starts and overall growth. We had 60% of builders that said, everything is fine in April when interest rates were 5.75%. Then we look at May. You went from 60% of builders to saying everything feels fine to 30%. The balance are then saying they feel a little bit worried about how the market is evolving. Now, we have some builders that are saying they're concerned. It feels like demand has really dropped off. But we have an expert here, Eric Allen. I talked to him, and he said the cluster is really that it's slowing a little bit modestly here in Salt Lake City. But in a lot of cases, it's almost perceived as good. You're going from white hot to hot, or extremely hot to hot. And so as we're looking at this, there's an interesting psychological element going on with buyers. There are some buyers right now that are motivated by what's happening. They're looking at mortgage rates. There's a classic case of mortgage rate urgency, home price urgency, fear of missing out. And oh, by the way, we talked about inflation being at 8%. You can lock now the largest share of your monthly budget by buying a home. Some people are thinking like that. But what we saw in May is also the return of people that are deterred. In some cases, deterred by choice. There's this idea of, I don't want to buy at the top. And some people are deterred by force. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Here, what we're looking at is the change in the monthly mortgage payment. The first number I'm just showing you, and you can find Salt Lake City towards the bottom, Provo, St. George on there as well. This is looking at what was the average monthly mortgage payment at the end of last year. We included the home prices that were last year, and we included the interest rate, which was 3.1% at the end of last year. Then we said, okay, how has that changed today? What has happened with home prices? I'll show you some slides on what we've seen in terms of home price growth. And then also what's happened to mortgage rates. Again, find Salt Lake City towards the bottom. You can see a 40% change in the monthly mortgage payment compared to where we were at the end of last year. And I imagine at the end of last year, many of you already felt like housing felt expensive. And now you add 40% to that payment. This has been a very, very quick change. And what we saw is in April, there was a little bit of an inflection point. Again, not as much in Salt Lake City and some of the other markets, but we are seeing in our data a little bit of shift here locally as well. Now, the inflection point, how do we identify that? What are we looking at to see some of the changes on the ground? And one of the numbers would be cancellations. This is someone came in, signed a contract, put down a deposit, wants to buy a home, and then, again, by force, by choice, they decide to step away. We had 40% of builders in May that said they saw an increase in cancellations at the new home communities. A few things to note. This is coming from basically no builders reporting cancellations, so it doesn't mean it is widespread. It is showing a little bit of that shift. Also know that a lot of the homes that are canceled are getting sold on, basically right away. There's enough people in the interest list. But when you think about this and you think about what groups are most impacted, we know that it's the first-time buyers. We'll talk a little bit more about them later. Another part that captures the inflection point is that a couple months ago, we had 5% of builders using incentives. Incentives mean someone's coming in, they're shopping for a home, and maybe they're just a little bit unsure, and so they have to sweeten the deal a little bit, maybe just throw a little bit of money to help secure the purchase. 5% were using incentives a couple months ago. Now we have 41% of builders in May that reported an increased use of incentives. Then the question is, what kind of incentives? So you can see I highlighted Salt Lake City towards the bottom of that. We can track it by market. We can track it by share of overall projects. We can track it by what kind of incentive. Right now, only 8% of the projects here locally. Not a high percent. Again, it's coming from close to nothing, and it's just capturing some of the shifts that we're watching. Those are our early signs that could lead to a little bit of slower activity as the market continues to move. But it's interesting, because I can talk about an inflection point, I can talk about a 40% increase in the monthly payment at the same time, that when you look at prices, they're still up double digits. So here, I'm using entry level and bottom tier interchangeably. Bottom tier is to tell you the bottom third of the market. We're also saying that could be entry level. The chart that says home value appreciation by metro, that is resale. New home price appreciation, obviously new home. So as you're looking at the different categories, entry level, move up, luxury, we're saying on the low end, you have 15% year-over-year home price appreciation. On the high end, we're talking 33%. Now this data is a little bit lagged. That's what I talked about. There's a little bit of a struggle when you're looking at data from March and April. Layering in what we know from our May survey. By the way, to add context, I know we're still in May. This was looking through the end of last week, so through last Friday. 64% of builders raised prices month over month. That was 97% 2 months ago. So the good news is we're starting to see not as many and as consistent price increases, but we also have to acknowledge why they're happening. Part of it is because of the cost of land, of labor, of materials. Part of it is that there's still pricing power. When you look on the ground and you talk about how demand is coming down a little bit, you also have the backdrop that new home community count, that's anywhere where there are 5 or more units for sale, is down 40% compared to 2 years ago. So yes, some buyers on the margin are dropping out, but you still have had that steady drop in new home inventory and then also in active listings. You can see active listings capturing your resale market. We crossed over last year's level for listings, so just a tiny, tiny improvement, but look at that relative to where we were before the pandemic. That pricing power exists because of what we're seeing in terms of overall inventory. So I want to take the discussion to the idea that the market, for the most part, is still holding up, it's shifting, but I think my question is, who can keep buying homes when home prices are going up as quickly as they are and in a really a rising rate or a higher rate environment? So I wanted to go into the buyer pool and say, okay, who are the most active shoppers? So we have collected this data every month since the beginning of the pandemic, and since then, the number 1 most active shopper was move up. The number 2 most active shopper was entry level. 3 most active is relocation. As we look at this, look at the trends. You see move-up buyers have held up totally fine in May. Look at that entry level drop. When you look at Salt Lake City, we pulled the same question for local builders. Move up number 1, relocation number 2, and then entry level buyers number 3. So let's talk about each of these categories. And I want to start with those move up buyers, or really just luxury buyers, any buyers that are using wealth to purchase the home. What we know is there has been an increasing number of people that are coming in to buy homes and they're using cash. Now, where are they getting their cash? And this is where I'm going to digress a little bit and link us back to the earlier part of this presentation. So S&P 500, I'm using this as our proxy for the stock market. And when I was presenting this just 4 weeks ago, I was saying, yeah, there's been some volatility in the stock market, but look at the 5-year trend. If you had money in the S&P 500 over the past 5 years, you were up 99%. That made sense where the wealth was coming from. In today's market, when I pulled it this morning, we were up 63% over the 5-year. You still have a lot more money than you did 5 years ago, but what we've noticed is a little bit of an interesting shift where people look at the year to date. Maybe they're not as focused on the 5-year, they're looking at their portfolio down about 20% since the beginning of the year. And while the wealth effect works on the way up, it also is an interesting dynamic as it works on the way down. Now, I bring this up partly because we do still know the stock market is contributing to the strength, but partly because I started the discussion saying the Federal Reserve was going to raise rates 7 times in total. At least that's what they were communicating. Do the financial markets do the job for the Fed? Meaning, do we have enough people that change their spending habits because of how they feel about their wealth and how they feel about the direction of the economy that we end up seeing the market come down almost naturally? So again, digress. I wanted to tie that back, and I want to keep going on the idea of wealth shoppers. So we have people that have tapped some of their money in the stock market. We have people that have tapped equity, their home equity. This is the average equity change over the past year. You can see Utah, 88,000. I want you to look at California, second highest in the country. There's a reason I want you to just keep note of that. When we're looking at equities, an important question is, when and why does this matter? If you're trying to move up within a certain market, being an existing homeowner will maybe give you a competitive advantage over a first-time buyer. If you're going to move down, equity is important. And if you're going to move from one market to another, equity becomes very important. And why do people move? Part of it is for tapping equity. Part of it's for tax reasons, politics reasons, lifestyle reasons, weather reasons, affordability reasons. And you guys heard at the beginning the talk about the change in the overall population. You look locally, even to this day, there are still 30% of searches here in Salt Lake City that are coming from outside the market. And where are they searching from? LA, DC, Bay Area. And remember, I said pay attention to that 117,000, that huge equity gain that we've also seen in California. And let's now think about if you're a shopper coming in from outside of the market, how do you feel about affordability? At the beginning, we talked about affordability and maybe growth is a bad thing. For some buyers, this market still feels so dirt cheap. So when you're looking at this, we pooled the average local size of a home in Salt Lake City, about 2,500 square feet, and a price just under $700,000. When we're looking at that, we said, okay, what is the equivalent price for that same size home in the top 3 markets where people are looking to move here from? In LA, the same home, $1.3 million. In San Francisco, $1.2 million. You think about sticker shock, you think about sensitivity to home prices, to rising interest rates. We know that some groups are more sensitive than others. So we're looking at this. You can then look at migration. This is data that looks at what markets have more people moving in than moving out. A positive number means, yes, that's what you're seeing. You can see most of the markets that we covered here are showing that positive domestic net migration. So we're talking about it. We know cash buyers. We know people that are tapping some of their equity and their equities. We also know there's a shifting landscape for millennials. Millennials, largest living generation. This is the group that people are so enthusiastic about for the housing market because their peak age right now, 28, 29, 30, 31, the ages where those lifestyles hit and those life stages hit where people get married, have kids, buy homes on average. When you're looking at this, we saw a really interesting shift over the past couple of years that I think makes for an interesting discussion point. We have been serving millennials every year for the past 6 years, and we don't care who you are, how much money you make, we don't care anything about you. We just want to know, are you a millennial? And we say, if you own a home, what size home do you own? 44% of millennials, in our most recent survey, this was conducted in January of this year, own a home under 2,000 square feet. That was 70% before the pandemic, and consistently 70%. So before you jump to the conclusion that our data is flawed, because I understand that's a very easy conclusion to jump to, let me tell you how we're viewing it. We know that the market has shifted in that people have moved because of the pandemic. Maybe the pandemic has made them want a little bit more space, but I think most notably, we're no longer talking about when are millennials going to be buying homes. They have been buying homes for years and years and years. And what this is capturing is that the mix is shifting. We have more move-up millennials in the marketplace as well. And so we looked at the data and we said, where across the country with a population of 1 million plus do we have the highest homeownership rates for millennials? And you can see, number 5, Salt Lake City. This is important when you think about what kind of housing should come online, because a move-up shopper, you can see, has already shifted into a different price point. They have different needs. But we also know, if you're thinking about growth and you're enthusiastic about millennials, you have to think about the remaining millennials who absolutely want to own. Every single year we've done this survey, less than 5% of millennials never want to own. The balance are absolutely interested in. But they're now, if you're not already an existing homeowner, some of them that are most sensitive to what's happening with affordability. So as we look at this data, we had the largest share of millennials that we collected at the beginning of this year that want to buy soon, in the next 1 to 3 years. And then we also have some millennials that say they want to buy as soon as possible, but limited inventory is holding them back. And then others that are saying we absolutely want to buy, but we can't save for a down payment. Now, the student loan deferment, that's done a little bit something interesting to that cohort. Maybe, Taylor, we can talk about that later. But we know that homeownership is still part of the dream. But as we've laid out, there are a lot of ways that the market is doing well, and a lot of ways that it's driving that double-digit appreciation. It's because you have relocation shoppers. You have wealth shoppers, move-up shoppers, investors. And in this case, the market's still a bit frustrating, but it works well. But to have a healthy, well-functioning, long-lasting housing market, you need to also cater to this other group where there's always wealth inequality, but that has spread so much and widened over the past couple of years. So what we've noticed on the ground, and this is what we've called the price ceiling, is that you're starting to bump up against that in some submarkets, where builders will say they've raised prices and they seem to have hit a wall with the buyers. And sometimes that wall is a mental wall. People are just a little bit hesitant. And sometimes it's an actual financial wall that goes back to force or choice. What we've seen, if you track this, there has been a pretty steep increase in the number of builders saying that they're running into qualification issues for buyers that are coming. They want to purchase a home, they have the interest to, but they do not have the ability to. And think back to the first part of the presentation. I was saying when you look at wage growth, the mountain region outperforming the national average, 6% wage growth over last year. Inflation, 8%. So if you don't have money diversified, which a lot of Americans don't, you're actually falling behind every single month. And you're falling behind with basic costs of living, but also how much the housing market is changing and how quickly. Hear out this math. If you had someone that wanted to buy a $450,000 home at a 3% interest rate, remember, 3% interest rate is what we saw towards the end of last year. If they could not have put another penny towards housing, they were already at the point that they were maxed out, that $450,000 home becomes a $350,000 home based on the change in interest rates alone. Put another way, a 2% change in interest rate translates to a 27.3% change in home price. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden no one can buy. It means consumers start to ask themselves the question, what matters the most to me? Am I going to move further away? Am I going to have a smaller house? Am I going to have an attached house? Am I going to take a different school district? There are a lot of questions that consumers then need to be asking themselves. And what we ask is the builders, what are you planning to do about it? What are you able to do about it? That's probably a better question. And as we look at this, we said to the builders, of your future communities, what home size are you looking at? 70% say they're probably going to build about the same size. And then you have an equal mix saying that they think they'll maybe size up and size down. And when you look at this and you think about the sizing up, why would you be sizing up? Well, maybe you cater to a luxury buyer. Maybe you have recognized that the pandemic has changed where and how people want to live. And in a lot of cases, it comes down to zoning restrictions. When you're looking at this, you can also take it from the other lens. Why are more builders not saying they're going to shift down in size? And in some points, we have the builders saying, there's nothing we can do. Entry-level buyers are left in the dust. This market does not work for them. All of the costs have gone up too much. But there's also a lot of builders that are saying, we're doing the best we can. We're thinking about more higher density. We're looking at the condo market. We're looking at ADUs, so at least people can use that rental income to help qualify for a mortgage. We're looking at different level of finishes. I think that's an interesting point, where we're down-speccing some of the homes and pushing the price up. How long are consumers willing to continue to buy a home like that? But what's the alternative? Rents. Rents that keep going up as well. One of the things that we looked at is what kind of solutions could you have is let's just look at the share of all projects nationally and then in Salt Lake City that are detached. You have 78% of all of the projects nationally that are detached, 74% in Salt Lake City. And I don't think attached is always the answer, but I just want to show some of the numbers behind that. If you're looking to try to help product, address product, there has been changes to what's available, but like we saw, still a lot of homes that are still single-family detached, which, by the way, is what people say they want. So that makes sense. People say they want a single-family detached home. But the proof is in the pudding. Look at the average sales rate. A well-executed, a lower-priced attached product has been outperforming what you see in terms of the single-family detached. There are a lot of people that absolutely want a 4,000 square foot home. They're going to settle with a 12,000 square foot home because it works totally fine, it's in the school district they need, and they can afford it, and the rent versus own numbers make sense. So what I wanted to do is say, well, what's happening with attached product here locally? I pulled the top 10 best-selling new home communities that have attached product, removed the builder name, removed the community name, left in the city, the price, the size. When you're looking at this, attached product, we're seeing a range between really 400 and 500,000 for the price point, and you're looking at the square footage, all of them. These are your best-selling, under 2,000 square feet. Remember what we talked about for the millennials. If we're looking at entry-level millennials, 70% of them are totally fine and purchased a home under 2,000 square feet. Then you look at detached product. And the detached product shows you more variety in terms of price. You can see the second bestseller is $300,000, the 10th bestseller, $704,000. You can see a difference in overall square footage as well. And I bring this up because I think it's easy to say, well, just build more lower priced product, but we also have to think about if someone is an existing homeowner and they have a home that theoretically could be an entry level or maybe a first move up home, how do you get them to move? What's the wow? What's the factor that the community can bring, that the home can bring, that can maybe help create a little bit more transactions? Now, there is friction, of course, in a rising rate environment and not having enough inventory, but I think these are questions that are important as well. So as I go to the final section, I want to recap some of the things that we talked about. And the first is acknowledging those delays and the costs that are associated with government services. And we're never finger pointing, but we just know that a lot of the cities are understaffed, and that's causing a little bit of tension and, again, friction. Land and lot, it's taking longer to get it done for development, it's costing more money. The labor shortage. We have 70% of builders that say the labor shortage is a massive problem for them today. It was 40% this time last year. That's how quickly it's changed. And we still have nearly 90% of builders that are saying the supply chain is an absolute huge headache for them, holding back the ability to get more homes built. When you look at the market and we're talking about what kind of product changes can be done, what is successful, remember why we care. Study after study tells you that homeownership is so important to building wealth. And each of the earlier presenters talked about what does the future look like for their kids. It's not just their kids, it's everyone's kids. How can we help them become a homeowner, build that wealth, pay to themselves, help with their longer-term financial planning? But as you also heard, recession. It's an increasing risk, absolutely. I think thinking through what kind of recession. What markets would be insulated? How should you plan for that? I think that really complicates a lot of the analysis because it's not just go, go, go anymore. We are seeing a little bit of a shift. And frankly, we're calling for housing starts nationally to go negative next year. Now, Eric Allen is our local expert. He is not calling for negative in Salt Lake City. He's calling for about flat growth in terms of overall housing starts. But watch that. Housing trickles into the wider economy. Every home that's built, it creates 3 jobs. People spend money elsewhere in the economy. We care about the housing market. And then also have the discussions. And I know that's why you're meeting here today. And we won't have all of the solutions, but we can pose some questions that maybe you should ask yourself. And one that you heard me really focus on in today's presentation is how do we help the locals? When you have people that are moving in that do not care if prices got to an average of $1 million, because the market still has some relative affordability. Here in Salt Lake, what you have is a virtuous cycle right now. You have what economists call agglomeration. You have more people moving in. You have more companies moving in. You have more diversity in people, more diverse restaurants. The area is becoming more attractive and it feeds on itself. But what we know is you also have some issues with that, whether it's congestion or competition for resources, whether that's higher shelter prices and trying to think through how can you grow but bring more of the population with you. Think through water availability and water rights. Eric Allen said this is a huge thing when trying to think about how much do you want to grow, where do you grow? What's the right balance? You saw those surveys. Those surveys say people are trying to slow growth, have more controlled growth. What's the right balance then of NIMBYism? What should be communicated to the residents here locally to understand why it matters to see different kind of product, maybe a little bit of density, different variety, why that matters to residents and longer term growth. I think this is a tricky one. Look at the lock-in effect. The lock-in effect is the idea that 90% of homeowners have locked in a mortgage rate under 5%. When today's mortgage rates are 5.4, we've seen them toy with 6. Is there anything? And maybe the answer is it's going to be really tricky. Are there any incentives that can be done that if someone has locked in a rate and they don't want to move, is there anything we can do to try to change that? How do we streamline the entitlement process? Again, not trying to bash or pick on anyone, but we know that the longer it takes and the more costly it is to go through the entitlement process, it does contribute to higher prices. And then ultimately, know what matters. And you saw Ari had done some surveys of local residents. What I think is so important is look at and talk to residents about what matters to them by age, by lifestyle, by income, by job. And I don't have that for Salt Lake City when you're looking at the economy and what kind of growth is supported. But what we do know is that when you're looking at millennials, again, this is from our survey, regardless of if they have kids, they're planning to have kids, they don't want to have kids, there are some commonalities that are really important, in particular with community development, whether it's access to restaurants and shops, safety, walkability, and even with this remote work environment, there's still that focus of being close to a lively part of the market and to some employment hubs. So with that, I ran 43 seconds over. Taylor, let me bring you up. I'm sorry to eat your time. Thank you, everyone.
Well, Allie, that was fantastic, really great. It spurred a bunch of questions. There's no way we'll ever get through all of these, but we'll do our best in the next 15 minutes or so. First, I just have to comment on the irony that we have 2 people, or maybe appropriateness actually, that we have 2 people from Southern California talking to you about your growth challenges here in Utah. And hopefully maybe we can present some of the lessons learned that some of these equally fast-growing and supply-constrained markets have experienced over time. So, so thank you. So, I think you've done a great job, Allie, in showing where we are, including in real time, in the housing market and how we got to this point. I'd like to talk a little bit about where we're potentially going at this point. Some of the questions that are from the audience address that as well. So what is Zonda saying regarding home price appreciation going forward? You must have some kind of forecast or thoughts about it. Are we likely to see growth slow? Are we likely to see any declines? What are you guys saying?
Yeah, and Taylor, I'd like you to chime in too if you have anything that you want to add, because it's a question that is really contentious. You will find people that think home price appreciation can only go double digits up for here, like indefinitely, because inventory is so low and the demographics support it. I would say, and you can probably tell I'm just more cautious by nature, but I would also say the idea that prices will never go negative again, to me seems wrong. We had an event recently where there was a CEO of a home builder, he's now retired, and he said, can you really point any time in history when prices did this, and then they just did this, and they just flattened out, and you never saw any kind of correction? I think that was reasonable when you look at a lot of different charts of a lot of different industries, not just housing. Our forecast is that we will still see home price growth this year, and as we look next year, I think a wider discussion is do we end up falling into that recession that we talked about? From our belief, I think a recession is likely, and if you do have a recession that's accompanied by job losses, I think you could see prices most definitely decelerate, but maybe in some cases go slightly negative. We haven't talked double-digit negative, we've talked adjustment down.
Right. I think we as a firm have a similar view at this point in time, just given the relationship between demand and supply nationally. I mean, even with a pullback in economic growth or job growth, we're still starting from a very, very low unemployment rate and much lower underemployment rate than we've seen over a longer period of time. And we just simply haven't built enough houses over the past 10 years to supply everybody. So seeing meaningful declines it seems unlikely, and we do have a very different situation today than we did prior to the great financial crisis.
Absolutely, and one thing I would add is we know that there's been the longer term undersupply of housing, but we also know that demand can be cyclical. So if we see, and you were talking about the supply and demand imbalance, if there was an environment where you saw a huge dramatic drop in demand, that story becomes different. But like you said, very different than the mid-2000s. Doesn't mean there could be some kind of softening, but it means dogs aren't getting mortgages this time around, which is good. That's what good people are.
We've made some progress.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
So I lived here in Utah for much of the pandemic while Los Angeles was shut down, and the number one topic of conversation while I was here, yes, I'm part of the problem, but number one topic of conversation was housing affordability. Number two topic of conversation was traffic, and they're all related to this growth. And a lot of people would say things like, gosh, I would love for there to be a downturn so that I could finally get into the market. So, I'm hearing we're not likely to see major declines in home prices, but is there some kind of scenario in which a change in the housing market could make housing more affordable on the Wasatch Front and in other markets like this that are seeing lots of growth?
So the answer really will depend. So an example, and I mentioned this to someone earlier, I pulled up the NASDAQ and looked at the year to date, and I was talking about the S&P 500 being down 20%, NASDAQ was down greater than that. If you have enough people that feel like their wealth has significantly changed, the investment in the Silicon Slopes, trying to change the market, and then all of a sudden some of the high wealth individuals aren't feeling as wealthy or are actually seeing anything come down, sure, I think there could be a scenario. I think that's a little bit of a stretch to try to play out if this, then this, then this, then this. But I think structurally you could see home prices come down, and that's only by changing product. So if you look at what is getting brought to the market, you may see overall appreciation levels not be as high, but part of that could be because you're bringing in smaller, it's mix shift. It's what's getting brought to the market.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting, and I want to talk about that a little more when we talk about potential solutions for this. But just kind of staying on the topic of what, if we don't do anything else, what could potentially make the market more affordable? The things that you're describing don't sound like good things that anybody want. The economic growth slows down. Everybody feels less wealthy, prices drop. So I think that's one of the lessons I've really taken in studying markets over a long period of time is that sometimes the solution or the cure is worse than the solution when it comes to affordability and traffic, by the way.
And we both say the cure for high prices is high prices. If you get prices too high and then the market adjusts, that's one thing to think about. But I know, Taylor, we had thought about looking at some of the other markets. So as mentioned, neither of us are from California. Both of us live in California now. when you think about how that market has grown, and remember that chart I put up with Salt Lake City, and I was looking at the attached product, and we said the attached product was between, the best sellers were between 400,000 and 500,000. In California, with the entitlements, with how built out it is, with the land prices, there are still attached product that's in the $400,000 to $500,000 price point.
Right.
Not much of it, but I think the question is, what are they doing? How is that still the case? And are there lessons that we can learn from a market like that, talking to their city officials, talking to developers, talking to builders in those areas? Because there has been really good product brought to the market in areas that have been way more expensive than this market, way longer, that I think could be really applicable to this market.
Well, let's talk about some of those in maybe a little more detail. So as you and your team look at Utah and the housing that's available, what segments, besides just really cheap home, the really cheap home segment, really cheap new home, what segments are not being adequately served?
Yeah, so when you're looking at it, if you remember, and I'm tying a lot of this back to the presentation, but last time I was here, and admittedly the last time I toured the market fully was before the pandemic for obvious reasons. And when I was touring that, it seemed that even at the entry level, I thought that the product was getting very interesting, very different than what I had expected. But I still think when you're looking at segmentation, the master plans will do a great job for that. But looking at that left side of the chart, if you remember, catering to the W-2 buyers that don't have that extra money. It doesn't have to be that down and dirty of a product, but we know that homeownership becomes important. I think when you're looking at where the market is growing, it seems like there's growth really in each direction. And as we were talking about, as I was going through a lot of the articles here locally, it seems like there's a lot of interest and time invested to try to help solve because I think the price point almost doesn't matter. It's just a general shortage of overall product.
Got it. So are there things, so you mentioned this in your presentation that this isn't necessarily just driven by the home builders and what they want to build and where they think the market is and so on. There are other factors at play. Can you elaborate on those a little bit?
Yeah, so part of it goes down to, well, I would say beyond the builders. I know one of the things that is a really hot topic is what we're seeing with the building material costs and what's happening with the tariffs. And is there any kind of lobbying efforts, which of course we know are being done by different local home building associations? I think that's an important thing that we need to be looking at. I know there's still a stigma and still some reluctance to shifting to any kind of offsite construction, which is not necessarily cheaper. I'm sure you guys have done some research on that too, but there is some time savings that could be done from an offsite construction point of view. I think another thing would be land prices. And I don't know how you can deal with that in an environment where developers have a scarce asset that you can't replace. But as the land prices go up, and partly in response to the higher home prices, that becomes another part of the challenge.
Right. Could this issue be solved just simply over time as the millennials kind of make their way through the market, eventually get some housing? They're followed by a smaller generation, most likely. So is this a problem that may evaporate in 15 years from now? We could overbuild to serve the millennials and then not have enough, or have too much, rather?
Yeah, I think I think it was Zillow calls it the silver tsunami. Mm-hmm. And so Zillow's belief is that we could get to a point where you do end up overbuilding because you have some of the existing homes that are freed up, and then you're trying to match the level of growth right now when the millennials are larger than the boomers, and as Taylor mentioned, the Gen Z are a smaller part of the overall cohort. I think to adequately answer that question, you would have to do the forecast of population. Are you going to continue to see those really high positive domestic net migration numbers? Because if you're looking at a market in isolation versus the national number, you will still have pockets of the country that are going to have more people moving in, even as you have some of the boomers sell their homes, millennials fill those, other additional home building. But one thing I will add to that is if you look at starts or permits over time, what I think is tricky is a lot of people say, oh, well, we're not for Salt Lake City in general, but nationally, oh, you're below the starts and permits that you saw in the last cycle. You have to think about where the developable land is. Where do people want to live? And in some cases, I don't think you'll be able to see those same level of starts when you have captured a lot of that low-hanging fruit, the land where people want to live near employment centers, unless you start going to some of those edge cities.
Right. Shifting gears a little bit, I've noticed both in the press and in public discourse that certain housing innovations are oftentimes being cast as the problems, even like bogeymen, relative to housing affordability in the for sale market, including in markets that experience a lot of tourism, and particularly short-term rentals, Airbnb, and so on. This is one of the questions that came up from the crowd. Another bogeyman, which is really getting a lot of press, are single-family rentals, kind of built both scattered site as well as build to rent. Are you looking at either of those or any others and looking at their impact on the overall housing market?
Yeah, and I want to be careful answering part of it. We at Zonda do a lot of work in the built-to-rent space, and the firm's opinion may be slightly different than my opinion on that segment of the market. But for the built-to-rent space, there are a lot of builders and developers that have basically said, game over on affordable housing, we can't do it, we can pencil the deal if we go into built to rent. I know from talking to some people here locally, maybe that's not entirely the case, but that they could even get it to pencil in the first place. But in a lot of cases, some of the land that I think in theory would make a lot of sense for entry-level housing is getting converted to single-family built-to-rent because the math makes more sense. And then I think it's my personal opinion, not Zonda's opinion, is it's a little bit of a shame when you think about how many people want to own homes. The single-family built-to-rent product is coming in as your rental alternative. Your product looks very similar to a for-sale home, but we know ultimately the consumer, in theory, would benefit by being able to purchase that home.
Right.
But it serves a need, and I think we understand that.
Right. I mean, the counter argument to that is that the market is essentially pricing the land to a large degree, that the rental builders are able to pay a higher price for the land, and that's driven by market demand. Do you see it that way, or do you think it's a capital markets dislocation that's potentially causing that?
I think it's the latter,
Right.
and I'm happy if you disagree, but
Right.
what we hear is it's just people say, I got a whole bunch of money that came from Wall Street, and they just want us to plant it in the single-family built-to-rent space, and we don't care what we have to pay for it. That's where they want to be because that's
Right.
the most attractive product right now.
I do think that's a potential risk as well, and I say that recognizing that we both have invested in it and work for a lot of build-to-rent operators. That definitely is a dynamic that's occurring right now, but not everywhere. It's really pretty focused in certain markets and sub-markets. Yep. So isn't the full story. It's not, and I think that's one of the lessons learned about affordability as well, is that there isn't a single innovation or a single policy change or intervention that you can make to change the dynamic. It's a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I'll say there is, and as much as I kind of knock down the built to rent, there's absolutely a place for it, especially in an area like this where you have a lot of people that are moving in. A lot of times what we see is it's higher income people that want to go into a built to rent space. In some cases for a school district, they don't have a down payment. In some cases they're new to an area, they don't know where they want to live. They don't know the area just yet. And so it's a good kind of starting point to get a feel for where they ultimately want to settle.
Got it. So we don't have a lot of time left. I just want to ask one last question. Looking forward, what are, how do you view the housing market in the United States performing over the next couple of years, and in particular here in the Wasatch Front?
So I want to start with the second part of that question, which is each year we put together lists of what are the top markets we want to pay attention to. And we were looking at a lot of the markets that grew because of the pandemic. And we were looking at, well, which ones actually have a sustainable market behind it in terms of a healthy labor market, a diverse labor market. To me, infrastructure is so important, and you look at some of the markets that grew, and you look at enplanements, how many people are getting on planes in those areas given the capacity of the airport, and a lot of the very high growth markets don't have that. And as work travel has come back, I think that still becomes a very important part of the discussion. Enplanements here in Salt Lake City, really reasonable. I've been to your airport. It looks a lot different than it did a few years ago. I know that there's a lot of investment in the market. I think focusing on the infrastructure, continuing to focus on the infrastructure, highways, airports, connectability in this market, I think is one reason that I feel good about the growth here in Salt Lake City. Housing market nationally, I think it will be a little bit bumpy for a while.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so I work for international institutional investors, and when I hear questions about Salt Lake City, interest in Salt Lake City from the United Arab Emirates, Israel, and Japan, I know that there's a story out there, and it's a good story. It's a good problem to have, but absolutely something that that Utah needs to tackle, and this is the group to do that. Thank you very much, Allie. What a fantastic presentation and discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, what a great discussion and what a great presentation. Ali, thank you. And Taylor, we so appreciate all you do for Envision Utah, and just great information. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to all of you for being here today. You know, what a representation of our great state. And I always mention this at the end of any of our board meetings, that I walk away so enriched. I walk away with a much better knowledge of our state and some of our opportunities and challenges, and I'm so grateful for that. Before we adjourn our meeting here, it's a real honor for me to, and she needs no introduction anywhere in our state, but it's Pamela Atkinson, and she embodies Utah's giving and caring nature. And she's been with Envision Utah virtually since the beginning. And Pamela, we're going to let this great lady have the final word. Thank you again for being here with us. Pamela, we love you, and let's turn the podium over to you.
And thank you to our fearless leader, Doug Wright. Who doesn't know Doug? If you've never watched Sunday Edition, record it and watch it after church, because he does a great job with so many different people. Well, I've set the alarm. I have a new i13 phone, and I love the swiping, no home button. I love that. And the only problem was when I got the new phone, they had this female American Siri, and she didn't understand me. And she and I have had some very heavy discussions. It's not exactly an argument, because I don't like to argue, but I eventually went into settings, and guess what? I found this wonderful British guy, and he understands 9 out of 10 instructions that I give him. You know, we talk about Envision Utah. You've heard today what incredible things Envision Utah has done, is doing, and will be doing. And I find it very exciting. Yes, I still work with homeless, low-income refugees, and prevention of suicide and these other issues. But there's something very special and very different about Envision Utah. And it's because, as it said, it matters how we grow. Have you ever been to any cities and towns across the country, and you look around and you think, my goodness, what unplanned growth? And here we've been avoiding much of that, because we're listening to the people of Utah. They're the ones who have something to say, because they matter just as much as you matter. We keep talking about growth in Utah. And if we don't have a say in that growth, it'll get out of hand. And we just don't want to do that. It would be great if you would think about helping by donating. And I know many of you have been very generous to me. I know I've asked many of you for money, and you've been absolutely great, and I've loved it for my other interests. But today I'm here to ask. I'm doing the ask. I'm not just speaking. It's an actual ask, asking you, would you please donate to Envision Utah? You know, there's a very different ways of donating to Utah, to Envision Utah. There's still cash. You know what that looks like, don't you? So you can donate cash, so that's one way. And another way that you can donate you remember what a check looks like? We don't use these very much, but I got out one last night, and I was delighted because up here it gives you instructions. It says the date, and then it tells you who to, make it out to someone. And then it tells you to put how much, and then you write out how much, and you sign it, and then you put what it's for, and it's a donation. And my feeling is, if you have a check lying around, do it. But you can also use a credit card. It's all right whichever way you do it. But please go online and help Envision Utah. You can give as little or as much as you want. But gosh, we'd be awfully grateful if you added 1 0 or 2 zeros or 3, whatever you can do. I love the way they saved money today with the fact that we were able to bring up the programs with the QR. Think of how many trees we saved today. And the company at One Utah Summit, they went even further. They gave you name tags made out of fiber. It had your name on it, and then QR on the back. And then if you read the lines on the back, guess what it said? Plant this name tag when you get home, water it, and you'll get flowers coming up. I mean, that's ingenious. I just want everybody to be ambitious and think of things like that Envision Utah is helping our environment. Some of you may have heard about the Englishman who was running for the Parliament again. He'd been in it for a long time. He was at a town hall meeting and he said, "I am proud to be an Englishman. I was born an Englishman and I will die an Englishman." And the Scotsman sitting near him said, "Oh man, have you no ambition?" And that's what I want us to be today, ambitious. Ambitious in our giving, ambitious in our doing, ambitious in following the goals and objectives, helping us at Envision Utah to create a much better Utah than we even have today, and it's great already. But keep in mind, it matters, and please keep in mind that you matter, and please give generously. Thank you so much. I think we're going to let everybody go now, is that correct? Yes.